What if I told you that one of the greatest military victories in history didn't involve mighty weapons or massive armies, but just 300 men armed with faith and obedience? This is the story of Gideon, a man who went from hiding in fear to leading an impossible battle against a vast enemy. With God's guidance, Gideon and his tiny army overcame insurmountable odds, proving that true strength lies not in numbers but in divine power. Join us as we uncover the breathtaking account of how faith turned the tide of history. Have you ever felt unable to face a challenge that seemed impossible? Gideon's story is exactly that, a man full of insecurities, called by God to do something unthinkable. Israel was being brutally oppressed by the Midianites, and the people were crying out for help. God responded in a surprising way. With just 300 soldiers, Gideon defeated a gigantic army and brought peace to Israel for 40 years. In this video, we will explore this unbelievable story where faith and obedience to God turn the impossible into reality. If you've ever felt that the battle ahead of you was too big, this story will show you that with God, no matter how big the challenge, victory is certain. But before we start, subscribe to this channel and share this content so that more people can be impacted by God's Word. Now, let's dive into the incredible story of Gideon. Imagine a scene of total despair. The people of Israel, who once experienced freedom and divine protection, now lived under one of the worst oppressions in their history. For 7 long years, the cruel and relentless Midianites devastated the land of Israel. Every harvest, the Israelites watched as their fields were destroyed, their crops looted, and their livestock stolen. Everything they planted with effort was taken by the Midianites and their allies, the Amalekites. Israel was in ruins, with no resources and no hope left. The Israelites were so oppressed that they were forced to abandon their homes and hide in caves, holes, and makeshift fortresses in the mountains. Imagine the daily terror, entire families living in fear, unsure of when the next attack would come, and powerless to defend themselves. It was a hopeless situation. No matter how much they planted or cared for their animals, everything was destroyed or stolen. The cycle of despair seemed endless. But in the midst of this chaos, something began to change. The broken and desperate people of Israel finally cried out to God for help. They remembered how the Lord had delivered their ancestors from Egypt and the wonders He had performed in the past. They knew that without divine intervention, there was no way out. And, as so many times before, God heard the cry of His people. However, God's answer would not come in a conventional way, nor through a great army or a powerful leader. The answer would come through someone who, at first, seemed unlikely, Gideon. Gideon was an ordinary man. In fact, when we first meet him, he is hiding from the Midianites, threshing wheat in a winepress. Now, if you understand how things work, you know that a winepress is where grapes are pressed to make wine, not where wheat is threshed. Gideon was so fearful of the Midianites that he had even to do something as simple as preparing wheat to survive. He wasn't a warrior or a leader, just another Israelite trying to survive the brutal oppression. Yet, God chose him. This is the beginning of Gideon's journey, a common man, hiding and living in fear, yet destined to be Israel's liberator. God had a different plan, one that Gideon could never have imagined. The story that follows proves that even in the darkest moments, God is already working on something far greater than we can see. Now, let us delve into the details of Gideon's calling. Gideon, a simple and ordinary man, was threshing wheat in an unusual place, a winepress. There he was, trying to hide his work from the feared Midianites. He lived in constant fear, just like the rest of the nation of Israel, hiding and seeking any way to escape oppression. Every day, Gideon did what he could to survive, with no expectation of change. However, on this specific day, something extraordinary was about to happen. As Gideon was focused on his work, the angel of the Lord appeared to him. The angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, and what the angel said was even more surprising. The angel addressed Gideon with the words, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Now, imagine being in Gideon's place. He was hiding, secretly threshing wheat, afraid of the enemy, and suddenly, he's called a mighty warrior. Mighty warrior! Gideon certainly didn't see himself that way. He was far from feeling brave, much less a hero capable of leading a nation. Gideon's surprise was immediate. He looked at the angel and, with all the doubts he carried, asked the question that many in Israel were probably asking at that moment, "If the Lord is with us, why is all this happening? Where are all the wonders our fathers told us about, how the Lord brought us out of Egypt?" Gideon was frustrated, not only with the oppression they lived under but also with the apparent absence of God amidst the people's suffering. Then the angel of the Lord gave a response that would completely change Gideon's life. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" In other words, God not only heard the cries of Israel but was ready to act, and Gideon, this ordinary man, hiding in fear, would be the instrument of liberation. Imagine the impact of these words. God was telling Gideon that he already had what he needed to begin. He, with all his weaknesses, fears, and insecurities, was chosen by God for a great task. But like any normal person, Gideon was still full of doubts. How can I save Israel? My family is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. He didn't see himself as someone capable of such a mission. Yet the Lord responded with a promise that would resonate throughout his journey. "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." God wasn't asking Gideon to rely on his own strength, but on the strength that came from God himself. This moment marked Gideon's calling. He, who once saw himself as the least of the least, was now being called by God to lead Israel in one of the most important battles in its history. This transformation, from an ordinary and fearful man into a mighty warrior, was just the beginning of what God was about to do. Even after the incredible encounter with the angel of the Lord, Gideon still had many doubts. Insecurity weighed on him like a shadow. How could he, such an ordinary man, be chosen to deliver Israel from the feared Midianites? These kinds of doubts likely echoed in the minds of many throughout history, but in Gideon's case, these questions ran deep. He didn't just doubt himself, he was still wondering if it was truly God calling him to this impossible mission. Then Gideon made a bold decision. He asked for a sign. It was an unusual request, but Gideon needed certainty. Imagine the tension and fear he must have felt. He placed a fleece on the ground and, with a heart full of uncertainty, prayed to God, "If it's really you calling me to deliver Israel, make the dew fall only on the fleece, and let the ground around it be dry." Gideon was on the brink of a monumental decision, and this request was his way of seeking divine confirmation. He wanted to know with clarity that God was truly with him. The next morning, Gideon woke up early, heart pounding, and went to where he had placed the fleece. What did he find? Exactly what he had asked for. The fleece was soaked with dew, while the ground around it remained completely dry. God had answered with precision, showing that he was indeed in control of everything. Imagine Gideon's relief at seeing that sign. Yet, even with this confirmation, he still felt a hint of insecurity. Cautious, Gideon asked God for a second sign, this time even more daring. Gideon prayed again, saying, "Lord, do not be angry with me, but let me make one more request. This time, let the fleece remain dry, and let the ground be covered with dew." It was the reverse of his first request. Gideon wanted another assurance that he wasn't imagining things, that God was truly with him and would support him in this difficult mission. The next morning, once again, Gideon approached the fleece. To his amazement, the ground was wet with dew, but the fleece remained completely dry. With patience and mercy, God responded exactly as Gideon had asked. It was as if God was saying, "I understand your doubts, but I am with you. Trust in me." These signs were more than miracles. They were proof that God not only called Gideon to the mission but was with him every step of the way. God didn't just want Gideon to lead but to lead with complete confidence in his power. With each sign, Gideon's doubts were being replaced by unshakable faith. God was confirming that he, the creator of the universe, had a plan, and that plan involved Gideon, the man who once saw himself as the least of the least but was now being shaped to be Israel's deliverer. The story of this test with the fleece teaches us about God's patience with our weaknesses and insecurities. Even when we have doubts, He is willing to give us the support and confirmation we need so that we can move forward with courage. Finally, after so many signs and confirmations from God, Gideon gathered an army to face the feared Midianites. He managed to assemble 32,000 men, which might seem impressive, but it was still far smaller compared to the massive enemy forces. The Midianites were described as being as numerous as locusts, covering the land with their countless soldiers and camels. But even though Gideon was ready to move forward with those 32,000 men, God had a different plan. God looked at the army and said something surprising to Gideon, "Your army is too large." Too large? How could that be? In human logic, the bigger the army, the better. However, God wanted Israel's victory to be clearly attributed to him, not to their military strength. If Gideon won the battle with 32,000 soldiers, the people might think it was because of their numbers and abilities. God wanted it to be evident that the victory would be a divine miracle. And so, the first reduction began. God instructed Gideon to tell his army, "Whoever is afraid may go home." With that simple announcement, 22,000 men left. Think about that for a moment. more than two-thirds of Gideon's army simply walked away. What remained was just 10,000 men. Surely, Gideon must have felt a heavy heart watching so many troops leave, but he knew it was God's plan. Yet, the reduction wasn't over. God told Gideon that even 10,000 men were still too many. Then came the second reduction, this time through an unusual test. God instructed Gideon to take the men to the water and observe how they drank. Those who knelt down and drank directly from the river would be dismissed, but those who scooped the water to their mouths with their hands would be chosen for battle. Imagine Gideon watching each soldier, knowing this test would determine the future of the battle. One by one, many of the men knelt and drank directly from the river, while only a small portion brought water to their mouths with their hands. When the test was over, only 300 men remained. Yes, just 300 against an army of thousands. Think of the impact of this reduction. From 32,000 men, Gideon was now left with only 300. What was already a disadvantage in human terms now seemed impossible. Gideon, who had felt insecure from the beginning, was now leading an army reduced to almost nothing. But this was precisely the lesson God wanted to teach. Victory wouldn't come from human strength, but from divine power. God wanted Israel to understand that when He is in control, human numbers and strategies are irrelevant. These 300 men were chosen to be part of a story that would be told for generations. They were few, yes, but they were about to participate in one of the greatest military victories the world had ever seen. Gideon, with his small army, was about to face the enemy in a way no one could have predicted. This moment in history teaches us that God doesn't need many to accomplish the impossible. He chooses the few, the unlikely, and through His power transforms weakness into victory. The reduction of Gideon's army was a preparation for something far greater than an ordinary battle. It was the prelude to a victory that would demonstrate the power of the God of Israel. Gideon stood before his 300 men, not armed with swords or spears, but with trumpets, torches, and clay jars. That's right, God's strategy to defeat the massive Midianite army didn't involve brute force or powerful weapons, but something much simpler and far more surprising. Following God's instructions, Gideon divided his 300 men into 3 groups, strategically positioning them around the Midianite camp. The night was dark and silent. The enemy soldiers, confident in their overwhelming numbers, slept soundly, unaware of what was about to happen. They could never have imagined that 300 Israelites were approaching for battle, not with weapons of war, but with faith and obedience to God's plan. Each soldier held a trumpet in one hand and a torch hidden inside a clay jar in the other. Imagine the weight of responsibility these men carried. They knew they were vastly outnumbered, but they also knew they were about to witness a miracle. Gideon, with a confidence that could only come from God, led them forward. At the exact moment, in the dead of night, Gideon gave the signal. Suddenly, in perfect unison, the 300 men blew their trumpets with all their might. The deafening sound echoed through the camp, shattering the stillness of the night. The mountains echoed with the piercing sound of trumpets, shattering the stillness of the night. At the same time, the 300 men smashed their clay jars, revealing torches that lit up the dark sky. It was as if the Midianite camp was surrounded by a massive army. But it wasn't just the sound of the trumpets or the light of the torches that caused panic among the Midianites. All 300 men shouted in unison, "For the sword of the Lord and for Gideon!" Chaos and confusion erupted in the enemy camp. The Midianites, waking up in the midst of the commotion, couldn't distinguish friend from foe. They believed they were under attack by a far larger force than was actually present. Imagine the panic that overtook them in the dark, the deafening sounds of trumpets, the glow of torches in every direction, and the war cries ringing out. In their disorientation, the Midianites turned their swords against each other. Desperation overwhelmed them, and they began killing their own comrades. What was supposed to be a peaceful night in their camp turned into a complete disaster for Israel's enemies. What had seemed like an unbeatable army was utterly dismantled without the Israelites even engaging in hand-to-hand combat. The Midianites fled, and Gideon, along with his 300 men, pursued them, securing a miraculous victory. It was a clear demonstration that Israel's strength wasn't in numbers but in their faith in the God who fought for them. Gideon, the man who had once hidden in fear, now led Israel to one of the most incredible victories in biblical history. He and his 300 men watched from above as the enemy army destroyed itself without a single Israelite raising a sword. The divine strategy worked flawlessly. What seemed like an absurd and impossible tactic to human eyes became one of the greatest triumphs in Israel's history. God had shown once again that victory doesn't come through might or numbers, but through His power. This moment teaches us a profound lesson. Often, God's ways don't make sense to us. Sometimes He calls us to use strategies that seem unlikely, but it's precisely in those moments that His power is most clearly displayed. Gideon, who had once been filled with fear, now led an army that triumphed over a colossal enemy using only trumpets, torches, and clay jars. The result was nothing short of miraculous. Gideon's victory was clear proof that when God is in command, even the simplest resources can become instruments of great power. His 300 soldiers were living witnesses that obedience to God, no matter how strange it may seem, always leads to victory. After Gideon's remarkable triumph over the Midianites, something unexpected happened. The people of Israel, still in awe of what they had witnessed, began to see Gideon in a new light. He was no longer just a victorious military leader in their eyes. They believed he was someone worthy of governing the nation. Imagine the people's enthusiasm. For years, they had lived under oppression, suffered great losses, and been forced to hide in the mountains to survive. Now, with the crushing victory over their enemies, they saw Gideon as a symbol of hope and strength, a leader they were ready to crown as king of Israel. Over their enemies, and with liberation finally achieved, a desire for stability and security filled the hearts of the Israelites. For many, the solution seemed clear: Gideon should be crowned king. They believed he was the right man to ensure peace and guide the people with the same bravery he had shown on the battlefield. The leaders of Israel gathered and made a formal request. They came to Gideon and said, "Rule over us, you, your sons, and your descendants, for you have delivered us from the hands of the Midianites." To the people, it seemed logical. Who better to be king than the one who led them to one of the greatest victories in their history? Gratitude and trust in the leader were evident, and many already envisioned a lineage of kings emerging from Gideon's house. But Gideon's response was surprising. Instead of being swayed by the power and adoration of the people, he gave an answer that reflected his true faithfulness to God. With humility and clarity, he said, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." This was a decisive moment in Gideon's life and in Israel's history. He could have accepted the offer, become Israel's first king, and started a dynasty of rulers. But Gideon understood something far deeper. The true leadership of Israel belonged to God and no one else. He knew the victory had not been won by his own strength or wisdom but by God's power. Instead of seeking personal glory, Gideon shifted the focus back to the Lord, reminding the people that it was God, not him, who deserved to be their king. Gideon's refusal of the kingship highlights his character in a powerful way. Even after such a grand victory, he remained humble, acknowledging that his role was to serve as God's instrument, not to seek power for himself. Gideon refused to turn God's calling into an opportunity for personal gain. This attitude teaches us a valuable lesson. True leadership is not about power, control, or titles, but about serving and pointing others to God. Gideon could have become a king, but he chose to direct the people of Israel to focus on their true king, the Lord. With this choice, Gideon ensured that the focus remained on God's faithfulness rather than human success. In this act of humility, Gideon reaffirmed that Israel's story was one of a people guided by God, not by men. He reminded the Israelites that just as God had delivered their ancestors from Egypt, he had once again delivered them from the Midianites. That was the true victory, not the crown they could offer Gideon, but the sovereign reign of God over his people. After Gideon's astonishing victory, a new era of peace spread across Israel. Imagine the contrast. A people once living in fear, hiding from constant attacks and invasions, were now free. The Midianites, who had been a constant threat, devastating their crops and leaving Israel on the brink of destruction, were finally defeated through divine intervention and Gideon's leadership. With the enemies overcome in such an impressive manner, life began to flourish in Israel once again. Families who had once lived in terror could now return to working their lands, planting and harvesting without fear of their enemies stealing everything. Children, who had grown up hearing stories of oppression and destruction, could now play outside without fear of being attacked. The cities began to rebuild. The villages started to prosper. And the sound of Gideon's victorious trumpets still echoed in the hearts of the Israelites. It was a time of restoration and hope. The peace that Gideon brought to Israel wasn't fleeting, it lasted for 40 years. For decades, the land experienced tranquility and renewal. This period of prosperity was a constant reminder of what God had done for his people. They had lived through a moment that, in human eyes, seemed impossible to overcome, an army of 300 men defeating thousands. Yet it was this miracle that secured the long-desired peace. During these 40 years, the Israelites experienced something they hadn't felt in a long time, the freedom to worship God without interference and the freedom to live without the constant threat of enemies invading their lands. The story of Gideon, which began with so much fear and doubt, transformed into a symbol of victory and security. The people's trust in God was restored. They understood that, no matter the situation, if they placed their full trust in God, victory was guaranteed. But this story is not just about a physical battle, it teaches us a much deeper lesson. Gideon, in the beginning, saw himself as the least of the least, someone without the capacity to lead or accomplish anything great. He was filled with doubt, insecurity, and fear. Yet God chose him precisely for his weakness to show that true strength doesn't come from men but from God. The story of Gideon shows us that God can use even those who see themselves as weak or inadequate to accomplish great things. He transforms weakness into strength, insecurity into courage, and doubt into faith. Gideon's victory is proof that when we trust in God and follow His direction, He leads us through the darkest moments to bring us to victory, no matter how impossible the situation may seem. Whether it's a vast army or a personal challenge, God is in control. Just as He did with Gideon, He can surprise us with solutions we never imagined. This peace of 40 years was a divine gift, a time when Israel could live in safety, always remembering that it was the hand of God that had freed them. The story of Gideon is not just about a courageous man, but about a faithful God who never abandons His people, even when everything seems lost. As we come to the end of this incredible journey through Gideon's story, we are reminded of the power of unwavering faith. Gideon started as an ordinary man, filled with fear and doubt, but through God's guidance, he led a small army of just 300 men to defeat a massive enemy, proving that when we put our trust in God, nothing is impossible. This victory wasn't about strategy, strength, or numbers, it was about faith, obedience, and the divine power that guided them every step of the way. Gideon's story shows us that no matter how small or insignificant we may feel in the grand scheme of things, God can use us in ways we never imagined. Even in our weakest moments, He can turn our fear into courage and our doubts into unshakable faith. Just like Gideon, we may face challenges that seem insurmountable, but with God's help, we can overcome them. So, as you move forward in your own journey, take this story to heart. When life feels overwhelming or when the odds are stacked against you, remember that God is always in control. Like Gideon, we are not called to rely on our own strength, but to trust in God's power to lead us to victory. And just as He delivered Israel from the hands of the Midianites, He will deliver you from whatever challenges you face. Thank you for watching this powerful story. May it inspire you to walk with faith and trust in God's plan for your life. Never forget, with God, all things are possible. Until next time, stay strong, stay faithful, and let God lead you to victory. See you in the next video.